Good afternoon. I'm speaking to you from the land of the Agurapol and Ketubul First Nations peoples. As you listen to my presentation, which is about sustainable practice, consider that Australia's First Peoples are custodians of traditions that are more than 50,000 years old and are still practiced today. I pay my respects to their cultures and their elders, past, present, and emerging, and I hope that one day we might earn their trust and they might teach us what sustainability really means. And a warning that my presentation contains graphic images. I'm going to explain what is a social license, why it affects horse sports, and why equipment and the way it is used to handle, train, ride and drive horses is on top of the FEI's priority list for welfare action. The term social license or social license to operate refers to the community's level of acceptance of certain practices and activities. This concept should be seen as a virtual license, unwritten and informal. It sits apart from other formal legal licenses that organizations require to operate, like those granted by governments. The social license is especially relevant to groups or entities whose practices provide both benefits to people but also generate costs, because society as a whole needs to figure out if the benefits are worth it, and it also has to decide which of the costs are acceptable and which are not. This is why the term social license was first used 20 years ago in relation to mining. Mining operations generally operate legally with all the right licenses because they provide benefits, raw materials for making useful products, employment and taxes, but they generate significant costs, habitat destruction, pollution, soil degradation, all of which have negative impacts as much on humans as they do on animals and the environment. And even though they operate legally, the laws can and do change, especially in democratic countries where the public may demand restrictions and push for tighter regulations. Mining operations must ensure that the public continues to support their activities and to believe that the costs are justified. I like to think about the social license as an ongoing public debate over whether the end, the profits, justifies the means, all the costs. Researchers who study public attitudes explain that the social license is made up of three components: legitimacy, credibility, and trust. Legitimacy is the extent to which the organization follows the rules. These include not just the written regulations, but also the ethical and moral norms, whether they are formal or informal. Integrity and fair play sit within this component. Credibility is about the organization's capacity to provide true and transparent information to the community and to fulfill any commitments made, which means that accountability also sits within this component. Trust is understood to be an emotional brain state associated with the belief that another entity, a person or organization, will behave in certain ways. When you trust a person or an entity, you have confidence that they will do what they said they would do. Legitimacy, credibility, and trust are built and maintained over time, but they can be eroded slowly or very quickly. For example, in 2020, mining giant Rio Tinto destroyed a network of caves containing 47,000-year-old Aboriginal artworks and cultural heritage. They caused incalculable and irreversible damage to the Putukunti Kurrama and Pinikura people's connections to country. But they had all the written licenses to do so. They had secured ministerial approval to blow up the caves to access an estimated $135 million worth of iron ore. This example shows an important point I want to make in this presentation, that losing social license doesn't mean that operations will cease entirely. Mining continues, of course, and even at this tragic site. What events like these do is highlight a major discrepancy between the written or legal licenses and the social licenses, what the public consider acceptable. Public outrage led to government intervention and tighter regulations in an attempt to achieve both, to keep mining going and the public satisfied that in the future mining companies will not ignore the value of cultural heritage in their cost-benefit analysis. But of course, it erodes public trust. Can such organizations be trusted to act ethically? Can they manage conflicts of interest without external oversight? The social license affects horse sports because they also provide benefits and generate costs that affect the wider community. And governments have largely left sport governing bodies alone to make their own decisions. But also because today the community is evaluating more closely whether the end justifies the means. Public attitudes towards animals have changed more in the past 50 years than in the previous 500. People are increasingly sensitive to animal welfare issues. Today, there is widespread recognition of animal sentience. Most people agree that animals, and certainly horses, feel pain and pleasure, and that they deserve to be treated well. And this concern for the subjective experiences of animals is complicating even more the already complex and long relationships humans have had with horses. Because a horse is not just a horse in people's minds. Representative surveys conducted in the United Kingdom have shown that 20% of the general public do not support the continued involvement of horses in sport in any circumstances. They also found that 40% of participants would support horses in sport only if their welfare was improved. The International Equestrian Federation commissioned similar research. Their convenience sampling, with around 15,000 respondents across 14 countries, found that 65% were concerned over the welfare and safety of sport horses. They were also concerned about human safety and horse sport's impact on the environment. These attitudes are defying the age-old justifications for using horses. In other words, people are questioning the cost-benefit analysis. These are the measures of social license. These surveys should serve as a baseline, and if the horse sector wants to track their sustainability, they should be repeated regularly by independent bodies. In any case, concern over how horses are treated is definitely not new. In his 1988 book titled Horse Watching, the ethologist, author and London Zoo curator Desmond Morris says that if the dog is man's best friend, then the horse could be well described as man's best slave. His introduction to this work on equine ethology contains the most compelling and blunt summary of the contradictions that I have felt during my own history of interacting with horses and horse people. As Morris says, for thousands of years and still today, horses have been harnessed, ridden, spurred, and whipped. In past times, they were ruthlessly driven into the center of bloody battlefields where they were hacked to pieces. In many countries today, horses are not required for these essential working roles, but they are still used for entertainment, what we call sport. And even in the richest and most industrialist societies, not much seems to have changed. Morris explains that horses are prey animals who live in small bands where sticking together and avoiding conflict are the most powerful survival themes. We know that free-living horses establish strong and long-lasting bonds, and it is this highly social nature that horse people have leveraged and aim to transform into a horse-human bond. Unfortunately for the horse, says Morris, this bond always ends up with a human partner coming out on top, both literally and metaphorically. But it's not all bad news, because for every example of ethical blindness or cruelty, there are many cases of conscientious devotion to horses. For me personally, after 45 years working among horse enthusiasts in a wide range of contexts, from riding schools to breeding, horse dealing, coaching, equestrian competitions, sports and clubs administration, and more recently journalism, science communication and research, across 2 hemispheres and 5 different countries, I have witnessed and participated in this paradoxical relationship we have with horses. And while I have seen firsthand good outcomes, I've become increasingly concerned about the devastating impacts that this obsession to interact, control, ride, drive, or watch horses perform can have on their welfare. There is no question that humans have benefited greatly from domesticating and using horses for whatever purposes we've devised. But today, in the 21st century, where horse sports are an entertainment business, the question people are asking is what the horse thinks about their life as a so-called equine athlete. For over 100 years, and especially at the professional and elite levels, horse people have always defended themselves by stating the bleeding obvious. We work with horses because we love horses. They are like family. Why would we hurt them? Horse sports were founded on a code of ethics that states the commitment of all participants to conduct themselves with the highest levels of integrity, to prioritize the horse's welfare. Unfortunately, there is plenty of evidence of the contradictions that Morris highlights in his book. Evidence that horse people's ideals and good intentions do not always align with their actions. Of course, these are examples that everyone recognizes as abuse and unacceptable. Each case led to immediate public condemnation and suspensions. However, stamping out abuse is not the same as achieving good welfare outcomes, which is what the public increasingly expects. In animal welfare science, the idea that welfare is more than preventing negative states and more than achieving physical health and performance is decades old. Welfare is about the individual animal's subjective experience, how they feel from their point of view. It requires us to consider the evolved characteristics of the species. But it is only this year, 2024, that the FEI has clearly acknowledged this concept. In a radical change of direction led by veterinary director Jordan Åkerström, and following the work of the Independent Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission, the FEI adopted the idea encapsulated in the 5 domains model, that welfare is about the horse's mental state, that horses should live a good life, and that a good life is one that respects the horse's natural evolved needs. This is a move that I fully support. It aligns with my understanding of the extensive scientific literature and my experience with horses. And the FEI are not shying away from admitting that the new welfare vision and the urgency in implementing it are a direct response to threats to their social license. They're not really concerned about governments banning horsekeeping, but they are very concerned about losing Olympic status. They have announced an ambitious welfare reform plan, but the big question remains, are the riders, trainers, breeders and horse dealers on board with the FEI's radical new direction? Will they even recognize what changes they must make and how they can match public expectations? Because several studies have investigated what horse people know about welfare and contrasted this against how they keep their horses, and whether in 2012, 2020 or 2024, they found that despite acknowledging the need for welfare improvement, professing a love for horses, and understanding their most important basic needs, like the need for friends, forage and freedom, horse people fail to recognize that the conditions under which they keep or use their own horses often fall short of their own standards. It seems that the challenge is not in educating horse people as such. They seem to know many of the basics that horses need. It is motivating them to see their own shortcomings and to do something about them at home, in their own stables, every day, and also within their own sport. The FEI hopes that their efforts will reflect positively. Their reform strategy is ambitious because they have a lot to catch up on. Let's consider why tack and equipment and how they are used in training is the #1 priority. The results of the surveys by the Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission showed that respondents were most concerned about training, riding, tack and equipment. And just last week at the FEI General Assembly, these were confirmed as the #1 item at the very top of the FEI Welfare Strategy Actions list. Back in 2022, the Commission had reported on the welfare problems of bits, and in particular double bridles, spurs and nosebands. At the time, these 3 equipment items were compulsory in FEI dressage. However, it's important to note that the concerns extend to jumping, because in their rules there are no restrictions for bits, nosebands and combination bridles. But of these 3 topics, I'm going to talk more about bits for several reasons. First, because the FEI has already announced new rules for nosebands and spurs, and it seems fair to wait and see what effect these has on the social license. Second, because both the noseband and the spurs are what I call accessories. And I mean it not in the fashion sense, but in the legal sense of the word. They enable riders to ride with very severe bits and very high rein tensions, which for the horse, from their perspective, translates to huge amounts of pressure on very sensitive tissues. The riders enjoy the leverage and precise control the equipment provides, but these accessories make it harder for the horse to escape or find relief from the high pressure in the mouth and around the head. If the horse tries to slow down, we have seen that behind the scenes, if spurs are not enough, some trainers will use whips and even electric shock devices to keep them active and moving forward. Nosebands make it harder for the horse to swallow or open the mouth, to relieve pressure on the lips and bars, and restore blood flow to the tongue. And importantly, both of these accessories mask the amount of rein tension that riders are applying in training and the competition arena. A third reason is because the riders, or more precisely the technical committees of both show jumping and dressage, have already dismissed the recommendations to make double bridles optional, and also refused to consider restricting the list of bits and bridles used in show jumping. They have delayed any reform until at least 2026, saying that bits are a technical issue, not a welfare issue, despite the Commission's 2022 report highlighting 12 bit-related welfare issues, including blue tongues, and citing 18 scientific studies. In social license terms, the riders and trainers approach is a big gamble, not least because of the timing. 2024 is the year when 3 of the world's top dressage riders were suspended and missed out on going to the Olympics and on horse abuse charges. But also because it is the year of the blue tongues. Not that squash and blue tongues and oral lesions caused by bits are a new welfare issue. They just became very visible this year, and they shocked veterinarians. There are tons of historical artworks and contemporary high-quality photos providing graphic evidence affecting all disciplines, whether it is at home or in the competition arena. Once you start looking, you can see horses dealing with mouth pain, while riders are focusing on their own sporting aims, pulling on one or both reins, sometimes using their entire body weight braced against the stirrups or the saddle knee rolls. There are just too many moments in time to ignore that bits are a problem. Horsemanship may have stated ideals of riding with soft, sensitive contact, and riders may strive to ride with so-called good hands. But just like the studies report, intentions don't necessarily match outcomes. And if we take the horse's perspective, which welfare science says we must do, dealing with bit pressures that as a horse you cannot control is a definite welfare risk. The horse is a herbivore who has evolved to select and choose suitable high fiber plants. They are meant to spend more than half the day every day of their lives grazing and browsing. The equine tongue is huge, muscular, and like other oral tissues, it is highly vascularized and innervated. It is incredibly sensitive, it can detect, taste, and move different foods up and down the long mouth, depending on whether it needs to be chewed, swallowed, or pushed out and rejected. All this, when combined with the fact that they cannot vomit if they happen to swallow the wrong plant, means that from the horse's point of view, the tongue is an essential, very valuable survival asset. Unfortunately for the horse, it seems that the tongue is also a valuable asset for humans. Since the beginning of domestication, much of the tack used to control the ridden and driven horse is designed to apply pressure to the tongue, as well as the bars and lips, of course. A glance at today's tack catalogues, as well as historical records, reveals that bits have remained the preferred equipment for starting, training, and controlling horses, as well as fixing all manner of problem or unwanted behaviors. Different equestrian disciplines aim to achieve specific types of head control and head-neck postures, and this leads to riders or trainers favoring certain designs over others. Curbs, for example, are popular in dressage and Western disciplines because they enforce pole lowering or flexion, whereas gags and combination bits seem more popular in jumping because they don't, and horses need their heads up to see the jumps in front of them. The Myler catalogue offers designs organized in a graduated system, starting at level 1 bits, which apply maximum tongue pressure. The idea is that the horse has to earn the tongue relief that the other levels are designed to provide. But of course, these words assume that riders will release the contact, which is a high-risk practice in dressage because the judge's manual says 37 times that riders are meant to always maintain the contact and that visible losses of contact with the mouth should be penalized. Meanwhile, the Bommer website explains that bits put pressure on the bars, lips, and tongues, and that all jointed bits, including double jointed bits, act as a nutcracker, pinching the horse's lower jaw from the sides. But riders can be confident because their bits can handle forces up to 90 kilograms. And this is just the snaffles. The curb bit is another nutcracker. It doesn't pinch the sides of the bars like a snaffle, but it traps and compresses the tongue and sensitive bars between the mouthpiece and the mandible. And thanks to the lever effect, it does that with very little rider effort. There's no time to discuss the welfare issues of bit and their accessories. I have recorded videos on that. But a reminder that the Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission reported extensively on the risks, including the risk of blue tongues, in 2022. And the technical committees have dismissed the evidence they provided. Earlier this month, dressage riders and trainers met under Chatham House rules to discuss welfare and public trust in private. At the press briefing afterwards, they told journalists that in line with the FEI, their number one priority is to protect entry to the Olympics. However, the responses suggest their action plan is not exactly aligned with the FEI's vision. They contradicted the FEI's survey results that a majority of horse people are concerned about welfare, saying the opposite, that most people are happy and it's just a small number of trolls, activists, and people who have no real understanding. They tried diverting the attention to other disciplines, and they contradicted themselves often, sometimes stating that there are big problems, while at other times saying they are very rare or very, very small. The journalists specifically asked about blue tongues at the Olympic Games in Paris, but the representatives said they knew nothing about it, which is interesting considering just how much attention they were paying when European media outlets began publishing images of blue tongues in the competition arena in the months leading up to the Games. It is the impact these reports had on riders that caused the FEI to monitor blue tongues at the Games, with a veterinary director confirming to the press that in Paris at least 5 horses had been identified with blue tongues and that their riders warned. It sounds like the riders and trainers want to be the sole judges of what is or is not abuse, and they want the public to believe them when they say they are working on something. Remember that the pillars of the social license explain the effects of trust on legitimacy and credibility. Like waves against the beach, every time stories break, trust is eroded. Some waves have more impacts than others, but they all add up. If horse people want to monitor the sustainability of their sport, they would be better off measuring the longitudinal trends in public attitudes than trying to deny that there is a problem. Every breach of trust highlights to the public that there are costs in using horses for sports. After every welfare or integrity scandal, there is a demand for accountability. Taking appropriate action can rebuild trust, but if those breaches are not addressed appropriately, for example, if all the words of the FEI fall on deaf ears and there is no change, or a reluctance to change, if the sanctions seem to be too lenient or show favoritism for some riders over others, and if the scandals continue to erupt in the media, there will be a loss of credibility. Over these years, Denmark has been living through this turmoil. Welfare and integrity questions have been piling up. From a social license perspective, when this happens, the legitimacy, the capacity of the sport to self-regulate will be questioned and perhaps trigger government intervention. This does not mean they will stop people having horses, but it does mean outside intervention and scrutiny, which they don't want. Horse people want to be left alone to do what they feel they need to do to keep generating benefits. It is unclear whether right now, in November 2024, riders can rely on positioning themselves as the sole arbiters of what did or did not happen at any event, or what is or is not a welfare issue, simply because of the sheer amount of evidence from different fields. But in any case, going forward, there is another aspect of the social license that deserves attention, and it is how all this affects participation, because that is economic support. Whether it leads to losing spectators and sponsors, and whether it risks losing tax benefits and access to government grants. In many ways, this is far more important because a reduction in the economic benefits of horse sports could seriously unbalance the cost-benefit analysis. So to finish, and I may have gone a little over time, I just want to say that from a social license perspective, in a world where people are concerned about animal welfare, increasingly informed and encouraged to voice their opinion, the belief that riders and trainers can avoid public scrutiny and can control the narrative is outdated and could backfire, simply because they've already lost so much credibility. Such a stance might highlight even more the contradictions the public can see with their own eyes, the paradoxical relationships humans have always had with horses. Horse sports' capacity to self-regulate without outside intervention may have worked for the past 100 years, but things change. And as Australia's First Peoples well know, only time can tell how sustainable a practice really is, and in the meantime, trust and economic impacts are measurable, and horse sports might want to continue evaluating the trends and gauging the effects of every one of their actions. Thank you.